This is Chapter 7, Auditing, Testing, and Monitoring, Part 3, How to Verify Security Controls, Monitoring, and Testing. First, we'll talk about intrusion detection systems, uh, network intrusion detection systems, and host intrusion detection systems. An IDS is a layered defense that requires multiple controls. You place it behind a firewall. A network intrusion detection system, or NIDS, monitors traffic that gets through the firewall to detect malicious activity. A host intrusion detection system, or HIDS, sees a narrower view, only on the host that it's placed on. It sees traffic that originates inside the perimeter. You connect the IDS to a management console that lets the administrator monitor and manage it. Ideally, the intrusion detection system will not be detectable from the network. As a firewall complement, here the NIDS device sits just inside the network firewall, while the host intrusion detection system, or HID, sits on the server itself. The two IDSs monitor traffic that make it through the firewall. So the firewall is going to have data coming from the untrusted network. The firewall is going to deny some traffic, but some traffic is okay, and some traffic is okay with an embedded attack. So when that gets through, the attack is logged and reported by the network intrusion detection systems, and the OK traffic goes through. Once it gets into the internal network, then the process exploit is terminated by the host intrusion detection system when it gets to the server. Here's a basic network intrusion detection system. As this diagram shows, you can connect the NIDS to a switch or a hub, although it's unlikely that you're going to use a hub. The IDS then captures all traffic on the switch and analyzes it to detect unauthorized activity. You connect the IDS to a management console that lets the administrator monitor and manage it. Ideally, the IDS won't be detectable from the network, so attackers won't be able to determine where the IDS is placed in the network. You can see coming from the hub or switch, data is to be analyzed at the sensing interface of the NIDS device, and the security events go to the workstation, the management workstation, then NIDS management information goes back to the NIDS device. Let's talk about some analysis methods. Pattern or signature-based IDSs. These use rule-based detection. They rely on pattern matching and stateful matching to compare current traffic with activity patterns known as signatures. It scans the packets to see whether specific byte sequences match the signature of known attacks. Stateful matching is one method of this. It improves on simple pattern matching, looks for specific sequences appearing across several packets in a traffic stream rather than just in individual packets. Anomaly-based IDSs, or profile systems, compare current activity with stored profiles of normal expected activity. These include statistical-based methods, which develop baselines of normal traffic and network activity. The device causes an alert when it identifies a deviation. Traffic-based methods signal an alert when it identifies any unacceptable deviation from expected behavior based on traffic. And protocol patterns. A way to identify without a signature block is to look for deviations from protocols. Host intrusion detection devices, or HIDs. These keep watch over sensitive processes inside a specific computer or host. They generally have the following qualities. They are usually software processes or services designed to run on server computers. They intercept and examine system calls or specific processes, such as database and web servers, for patterns or behaviors that should not normally be allowed. HIDS daemons take a predefined action, such as stopping or reporting the infraction. HIDs also have different point of views than the network intrusion detection systems. Since they are inside the network, a HIDS can detect inappropriate traffic that originates inside the network. It can also recognize an anomaly that is specific to a particular machine or user. An example of HIDS detection, a single user on a high-volume mail server might originate 10 times the normal number of messages for a user in any day or hour even. The HIDS will notice and issue an alert, but a network intrusion detection system may not notice a reportable event. For the NIDS, it just looks like increased network traffic. Here we see an example of layered network devices trying to prevent an attack on the internal protected network. So here you have the untrusted network, traffic disallowed by the router that's been filtered, traffic allowed, the dotted lines, by the router, but not the firewall, which rejects it. And then traffic allowed by the router and the firewall goes through the router, then through the firewall into the trusted network. And this is at the firewall is what we would call a security domain divider. Host isolation. Here we see the firewall sending some data into the demilitarized zone where it goes to a web server, an email server, and their host intrusion detection system processes running on both servers. So the dotted lines represent the internet to DMZ host communication, and as well as the solid lines representing DMZ to internal host communication. Data comes from the internal email server, web server data through the trusted network to the firewall, and then to the DMZ. Some servers or hosts, such as web servers, must be open to the internet. Web servers are good examples. You want any user to be able to access your web server, but you don't want everyone to be able to get to your internal network. The simple solution is to isolate the host connected to the internet from the rest of your network. Host isolation isolates one or more host computers from your internal networks and creates a demilitarized zone or DMZ. Here you see a DMZ with two isolated hosts, the web and email servers. A DMZ is a physical or logical subnetwork that contains and exposes an organization's external services to a larger untrusted network, usually the internet. Outside traffic from the untrusted internet is allowed only into the DMZ, where it can get to certain public company services. Let's talk about system hardening. A hardened configuration is one on which you have turned off or disabled unnecessary services and protected the ones that are still running. This requires you to apply the latest software patches available. You need to set a baseline configuration. After hardening, you must record the hardened configuration settings. Then compare the hardened configuration against known secure settings. You need to disable unnecessary services. Attackers know that most computers run more services than they really need. For example, many server computers run web servers even if they don't host a website. Harden all your routers and other network devices too. Protect against unauthorized administrator access and changes to router tables. And don't forget your workstations. Remove all unnecessary programs and applications from them. So let's briefly talk about ethical hacking. It seeks to identify and demonstrate exploits for discovered vulnerabilities. Good guys employ technical methods used by the bad guys. Again, it helps to expose and prove these inherent weaknesses that must be addressed by administrators and security professionals. Also called penetration testing, or black, white, or gray box testing. Audits and assessments are performed in large organizations by dedicated teams, but smaller organizations may lack the resources. Organizations may lack the resources or knowledge about how to plan and execute a comprehensive penetration test. Internal teams may lack the experience to write one-off exploits or run complex attacks that require specialized knowledge. Some companies simply don't appreciate the value of a strong security posture until a big problem raises awareness. Ethical hacking seeks to expose a broad range of security issues, such as vulnerability research and development are specialized. Ethical hackers are experienced in conducting various attacks. Hacker teams can draw specialties across different technologies, and they can help provide a thorough perspective of organizational security. The role of ethical hacking. Ethical hackers are white hats experienced in penetration testing and security assessments. Ethical hacking tests security controls against actual attacks. You have to ask who checks whether or not your security measures are actually effective. And how can you be confident that policy controls adequately address security objectives? Security auditing and security assessments identify issues but required skilled professionals to perform. Security testing. In addition to monitoring a system, you must test it. The frequency of testing depends on factors such as volatility, rate of changes of the system, and the sensitivity or criticality of the system. Also, policy and regulation often mandate tests. There are several different common test schedule trigger points. Some of these include during the security certification phase, after major system changes, such as new technology upgrades or application changes, new threats, during system audits, periodically depending on the nature of the system, and once a year on critical systems. Your testing roadmap. Most common testing activities include the following. Reconnaissance, reviewing the system to learn as much as possible about the organization, its systems, and its networks. Network mapping, use tools to determine the layout and services running on the organization's systems and networks. Vulnerability testing, finding all the weaknesses in a system and determining which places may be attack points. Penetration testing, you try to exploit a weakness in the system and prove that an attacker could penetrate it. And mitigation activities, reduce or address vulnerabilities found in either penetration tests or vulnerability tests. You need to establish testing goals and do this before you run your testing procedures. Security testing is most concerned with evaluating how well your controls address vulnerabilities. First, you need to identify vulnerabilities and rank them according to how critical they are to your systems. Next, document a point in time or snapshot test for comparison to other time periods. Then prepare for the auditor review. Lastly, find the gaps in your security. This enables covert testers to determine the likelihood of system compromise and intrusion detection. Security testing. So here we see a data center host. Before it, unnecessary services are removed, insecure services removed, system and services are patched, antivirus IDS installed, least privilege on files. Vulnerable service added to the host. Afterwards, you have your data center host again, unnecessary services removed, insecure services removed, system and service needs patched, antivirus IDS installed, least privilege on files, and then the results, you found one unpatched service as a result of scanning the host. Security testing. Reconnaissance centers on learning about the system you want to test by using public information sources and other low-tech methods like the telephone or persons working for an organization. Network mapping, then you go to that, centers on using software tools that scan for services up and running on systems. Then you perform vulnerability testing, which centers on using software tools to ascertain which services may be vulnerable to attack, which could lead to mitigation activities from that point. Or you could go on to penetration testing, centering on carrying out an attack by exercising one or more vulnerabilities and then go on to your mitigation activities. Reconnaissance methods. Social engineering, a non-technical method, the fancy phrase for lying, tricking someone into sharing confidential information or gaining access to sensitive systems. The Who Is service. This provides information that can help attackers such as name and phone number of web administrators. Zone transfer, a unique query of a DNS server that asks it for the contents of that should be its zone, which is the domain that the server manages. Here we show some network mapping. This allows attackers to identify certain types of systems as well as hosts and host addresses and certain applications running on those hosts. Here, the attacker can determine that the internal network address translation, NAT, provided address of 10.5.5.5 is the host name user5 running, and it's running HTTP. Well, nearly all workstations run this, but many servers don't. NetBIOS and FTP, file transfer protocol, and its operating system is the outdated Windows Server 2003. So if the attacker knows of various vulnerabilities with the outdated Windows Server 2003 and knows the exploits for those vulnerabilities, he or she can attack the host. And each username, each host name has a different name, server 6, server 7, and you look at each IP address, see what's running on them, and if you know the operating system or you know the services, after you've done your probes on the network, you can determine what vulnerabilities exist for the latest version of those services or protocols and what vulnerabilities exist for that version of that operating system, and then you can plan your attack accordingly. Here's network attacking with the ICMP ping command. Here the attacker is using ping packets to discover the network layout, which gives the attacker an advantage in setting up the attack. If ICMP is blocked at the Tony router, which is down near the bottom of the slide, that's good as it prevents the attacker from learning about the network, because if ICMP is not allowed through that router, they wouldn't be able to get to the server bada bing. But it also prevents the network administrator from being able to use ICMP as a valuable tool for troubleshooting the network. So on the top, all echo requests get through and all echo replies, in other words, a ping command is transmitted back through router curly. And so the message that goes back to the probing host, here's the echo request or the solid lines, and the reply, ICMP echo reply, are the dotted lines. And it says IC Mo, Larry, and Curly. And here, where it's rejected at this point, because you're not allowing ping, you get a message back that says, I don't see anyone. Discovering a network using TCP SYN scans. Here the attacker sends packets to common ports and can determine from the response that the ports are open and whether the host accepts these services. For example, on the left side, the SYN acknowledgement on port 23 shows the attacker that the target host is servicing Telnet. So the probing host sends a SYN on TCP port 23. The target sends the SYN acknowledgement back, synchronization bit, acknowledgement bit. And when the acknowledgement bit goes through, the conclusion is the target services Telnet. If the probing host sends a SYN on TCP port 23 and a reset packet is sent back, the conclusion is the target doesn't service Telnet because they got a reset packet as opposed to a SYN-ACK and an ACK. Now that's actually information the bad guy can use. In the first case, he knows that they're running Telnet on that server. In the second case, he knows they're not. He doesn't know what they are running, but he knows it's not Telnet. In the right-hand side, network mapping with a SYN half open scan, so a SYN on synchronization packet sent TCP port 143 to the target. The conclusion of the target is IMAP is 143, so they get a SYN-ACK back, and the reset goes back to the target, and the conclusion is the target services IMAP, which is male. On the other hand, the SYN goes to port TCP port 143, and they get a reset back without a SYN acknowledgement, then the target doesn't service IMAP, and so the bad guy knows that you're not running IMAP on that server. Of course, he doesn't know what else is running on it, but he knows IMAP's not. Operating system fingerprinting. By determining the operating system on each host, the attacker can determine what vulnerabilities may exist and what attacks can be used to exploit these vulnerabilities. So I believe this should be 10. Now, I must have, well, you can see I actually cut it off when I copied it, but it's 10.5.5.230, and the probes go into the network, and what port mappers think is 10.5.5.5 looks like Windows Server 2003 based on the way its TCP/IP communications are structured. .5.5.6 looks like Windows Server 2008 because it did not respond with the reset packet when I sent a finish, and it runs IIS5 according to the HTTP banner running on it. And 10.0.5.5.7 looks like Linux because it did send back the reset packet in response to my fin packet, and its TCP/IP communications behave like Linux. So it's possible to determine a lot of information just by sending packets to a network in the hope that it gets through and returns with information. Penetration testing. So this employs testing methodologies depending on the scope of access and information provided by the client: black box, white box, and gray box. Covert and overt testers. A covert tester is an IT contractor, external audit staff, internal audit staff, or internal IT staff. They take a hostile attacker role, test without warning, little guidance from the staff. So you're going to test the corporate LAN and see what comes back. An overt tester, of course, both of these people are testing your network. So these different types of testers are all legitimate. It's just the way they do it. Your overt tester would be, again, the same kind of people, but it's with full staff cooperation with planned test times. And they have diagrams, network diagrams, and information so that you know they're going to do it. They know what they're looking at. They get guidance from the staff and they get information back. Both types of testing are valid and useful. Employing countermeasures. You monitor security at several layers of the environment. System logs record user interactions, service statuses, and historic failures and events. Service logs record user interactions, service failures, and runtime conditions. Application logs record user interactions, application failures, and runtime conditions. And network logs record device statuses, traffic conditions, and routing failures. In summary, IT security assessments and audits verify, validate, test, and evaluate the infrastructure. Penetration testing helps mitigate security gaps. Security log monitoring reveals normal and abnormal traffic patterns and digital signatures. System and network monitoring helps prevent attacks and unauthorized access. And appropriate security countermeasures are determined through auditing, testing, and monitoring results, test results. And this concludes Chapter 7.